What did you just do to my car? Ma'am, I have no idea what you're talking about. I know what you did. This is going to cost you. Yeah, that was Karen, screaming at me while circling my car like a hawk. Grab your popcorn, smash that like button, and settle in because this wasn't going to be your average neighborhood drama. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone mixes entitlement with chemical destruction? I didn't either until Karen decided my car deserved a very, very expensive makeover and ended up demolishing her own life in the process. I was leaving for work that morning, the sun barely peeking over the rooftops when I saw her. Karen was standing at the end of the cul-de-sac, hands on her hips, her face twisted in that familiar scowl that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. She wasn't just frowning or muttering to herself like usual. There was something in the way she moved, a jittery intensity, like she had been waiting for this exact moment, like she had rehearsed it in her head dozens of times. I slowed my car instinctively, gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to figure out what her problem was this time. Her gaze locked onto my car, as if it were a personal insult, something she had a right to punish. She was holding a small bottle in one hand, shaking it slightly, the liquid inside catching the light and turning it into a warning. I had no idea what it was, but the way she held it like it was a weapon made my stomach drop. My first thought was that it might be some kind of cleaning solution or gardening chemical, but the intensity in her eyes told me this wasn't about cleaning anything. She wasn't here to water her plants or measure property lines. She was here on a mission. Her other hand rested on her hip, and her shoulders were tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. I tried to catch her attention, rolled down my window and called her name, but she didn't even flinch. She was staring, scanning, calculating. Every step I took, she mirrored with a movement of her head or a shift of her weight. The neighborhood was still quiet, only the hum of morning traffic in the distance, but it felt like time had slowed down around us. I realized I wasn't just witnessing a cranky neighbor. I was seeing the first act of something far more deliberate. Her eyes darted toward my car, then toward my driveway, then back to the bottle in her hand. She seemed to be measuring, weighing, imagining the consequences, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I had no idea that this morning walk to the car would be the moment everything changed, the point where a single neighbor's obsession would threaten to unravel not just my day but my life, all before a single word was spoken. I couldn't take my eyes off her as she shifted from the end of the street toward my driveway. In her hand was the bottle, the liquid inside glowing faintly in the morning light, and I realized that whatever she had planned, it wasn't going to be subtle. She moved with a kind of predatory focus, careful, deliberate, like she had rehearsed every step in her mind 100 times before. The neighbors were starting to stir behind their curtains and windows, but she didn't care. Her entire attention was locked on my car. I tried to step forward, to call out again, but my voice caught in my throat when I noticed the label on the bottle. The words were faint, partially worn away, but I could just make out letters that made my skin crawl: corrosive, handle with care. The type of warning you only ignore at your own peril. She stopped just short of my driveway, eyes darting from the bottle to my car, then back to the street, as if calculating the exact distance she could throw it without alerting anyone else. She glanced over her shoulder, caught the gaze of a neighbor, and smirked like she was daring them to stop her. Then she shook the bottle lightly again, letting the liquid swirl, and I could see the greenish tinge glinting like some poisonous jewel. It was absurd, terrifying, and completely insane all at once. I felt my pulse quicken. I had to do something. I wanted to grab the bottle, to wrest it from her hands, but I also knew that any sudden movement might push her to actually use it. She had that kind of energy, the kind that could make ordinary people do extraordinary, reckless things. I tried reasoning with her. I raised my hands, my tone calm but firm, asking her what she was doing, trying to reach some shred of rational thought behind those wild eyes. But she didn't respond. She only tilted her head, watching, waiting, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she wasn't here to talk. She was here to act. My mind raced. How had it come to this? How could a simple parking disagreement or a minor neighborhood spat escalate into something that involved what looked like chemical warfare against my car? Every instinct I had was screaming that this was beyond a prank or a tantrum. Her entire demeanor was a warning. For a moment, she lifted the bottle slightly, almost ceremoniously, and I froze. Time seemed to stretch as I tried to predict the consequences of that single motion. My neighbors peeked through blinds and doorways, sensing the tension in the air. I felt trapped between disbelief and fear, watching as her obsession with some imagined injustice focused entirely on my car unaware that she had no idea how completely outmatched she was about to become. It all started with something so mundane, it felt almost laughable now. A single parking spot, a little too close to her flower bed, and suddenly I was the enemy. Karen had made it her personal mission to patrol every inch of the street, clipboard in hand, cataloging perceived infractions like a general surveying a battlefield. I had parked my car in the driveway that morning, perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary, but in her eyes it was a deliberate provocation, a challenge to her self-appointed authority. The moment I backed out, she appeared on her porch, hands on hips, glaring at me as if I had personally insulted her. She started muttering under her breath, pacing like a caged predator, stopping occasionally to scribble notes on that clipboard that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe she'd calm down, maybe she'd get bored, but Karen never got bored. Her eyes followed me like lasers, tracking every movement, every turn of the steering wheel. When I waved a friendly hello, she didn't even flinch. Her scowl deepened and she shook her head as if my existence alone was a crime against the neighborhood. The neighbors had started to notice. A few curious heads peeked over fences and through blinds, whispering and nodding at each other, sharing looks of quiet disbelief. I could feel the tension building like static electricity in the air. Karen muttered something about community standards and property rights over and over again, each repetition more fervent than the last, as if saying it enough would make the universe agree with her. I realized that this parking dispute wasn't really about a car or a driveway, it was about control. It was about her asserting dominance, about proving that she could manipulate the world around her through sheer volume and obsession. She crouched slightly to take notes, her brow furrowed, lips moving silently as she wrote, every gesture precise, measured, rehearsed. I didn't know it yet, but this was the prelude to something far worse. The obsession, the fixation, the meticulous documentation were all building toward a crescendo. She wasn't just angry about a parking spot. She was imagining what she could do to enforce her idea of justice, the kind of twisted retribution that would soon involve chemicals, cameras, and a performance worthy of its own viral clip. That morning, a simple neighborhood disagreement became the spark that would ignite a week of escalating chaos, turning ordinary suburban streets into the stage for Karen's self-destructive vendetta, all centered on the way I had dared to exist in my own driveway. By mid-morning, it was clear that Karen's obsession had drawn attention. I noticed Mr. Thompson, the retired school principal from 2 houses down, standing on his porch with a pair of binoculars, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene in my driveway. He didn't wave or call out. He just watched, quietly, as if trying to understand what kind of storm had landed in our quiet neighborhood. There was a gravity to his posture, a sense that he had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize when something dangerous was taking shape. He wasn't gossiping or nosy. He was observing, cataloging, and calculating the way someone trained to assess risk would do. Karen paced back and forth, her hands gripping that bottle, glancing at my car, then at the street, then back at the bottle as though timing its deployment mattered more than anything else in the world. Mr. Thompson raised a hand to shield his eyes from the sun and shifted slightly, making small notes in a weathered notebook he always carried. I realized he was documenting her movements, her gestures, and even her expressions. It was unsettling to see someone else treating this like a lesson in human behavior while I was trapped in the middle of her wrath. I tried to catch Mr. Thompson's eye, hoping for some kind of signal that he might intervene, but he didn't flinch. His attention was entirely on Karen, and he was cataloging every motion, every twitch, like a forensic analyst preparing a report that could never be ignored. A bead of sweat slid down her temple, but she didn't notice him. Her focus was entirely on me in the car. I could feel the tension radiating from her, an invisible line drawn in the asphalt between us, and every neighbor who dared peek from behind curtains held their breath. Then Karen crouched slightly and leaned closer to the car, her movements calculated and deliberate. Mr. Thompson took a small step forward, as if to get a better vantage point, but he didn't interfere. He simply observed, recording mental notes of her obsession, her audacity, and her meticulous attention to detail. It was like watching a predator at work, and a witness who understood that observing could be as powerful as acting. I realized in that moment that Mr. Thompson might be the first person to truly see the lengths Karen was willing to go. He wasn't just a neighbor or a bystander. He was a sentinel, silently bearing witness to the prelude of a week-long nightmare. His calm presence was oddly reassuring and terrifying at the same time. Someone was watching her as closely as she was watching me, and it was only a matter of time before that attention would tip the scales in ways neither of us could yet predict. It happened just as I was stepping toward my car, the engine idling softly, when Karen whipped out her phone and began shrieking into it like she was narrating the end of the world. Her voice cracked and carried through the cul-de-sac, high-pitched and frantic, a mixture of fury and fear that seemed entirely self-generated. "Property violation, trespassing, acid threat," she screamed. Each word punctuated the air like bullets, and I could see the neighbors peeking through blinds, whispering to one another, trying to understand what had turned a quiet morning into a live-action soap opera. She spoke rapidly, almost rhythmically, as if every syllable had been timed to convey maximum urgency and terror. I froze, unsure whether to step forward or retreat, as she waved her hands for emphasis, juggling the phone and the small greenish bottle in a delicate balancing act that seemed almost ceremonial. She was explaining, or trying to explain, some imagined narrative where I had committed crimes against the neighborhood, the HOA, and apparently the moral order of the universe. Her words tumbled over one another in a jumble of accusations that grew more elaborate by the second. It was like she believed the more she screamed, the more reality would bend to her story. Through the open windows I could see Mr. Thompson, still observing from his porch, raising a hand slightly as if to signal caution, but he didn't move closer. His presence was a silent reminder that someone else was watching, cataloging, and documenting her descent into mania. The intensity in her eyes, the rigid line of her shoulders, and the set of her jaw made it clear she had moved beyond petty grievances. She had rehearsed this performance in her head, perfected it to the smallest detail, and she believed the world would bear witness. I tried speaking, keeping my tone calm, attempting to insert reason into the chaos, but her eyes never left the phone. She didn't hear me. Every argument I made dissolved into her torrent of words, each accusation growing more intricate and impossible. The bottle in her other hand swayed slightly with her gesturing, catching the sunlight and throwing a faint green reflection across the driveway. I realized then that her shrieking call was not just communication, it was preparation, a signal, a psychological escalation designed to make me doubt my own perception and to broadcast her narrative to anyone who might be listening. The sirens weren't far behind, but in that moment, it felt like the street itself had been consumed by her fury. The neighbors whispered, the wind rustled, and Karen's voice carried on, growing louder, more manic, as if to challenge the universe itself to intervene. This was no ordinary dispute. This was the opening act of a carefully choreographed spectacle, one that would only escalate from this moment forward, and I had no idea how high the stakes would climb. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, I noticed movement near the edge of my driveway. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and there she was, crouched low behind the hedge, binoculars pressed to her eyes. Karen had been there for hours, I realized, because the air smelled faintly of her coffee thermos and a hint of floral perfume that she wore like armor. Her posture was precise, deliberate, and frighteningly patient, as if she were performing a ritual rather than simply watching a car. Every shift of her weight, every tilt of her head, was calculated. She wasn't a neighbor with a grudge. She was a strategist, a meticulous observer cataloging my movements with a dedication that bordered on obsession. I slipped quietly to the window, peeking through the blinds, trying to gauge her intentions. Her clipboard was open, pages fluttering gently in the morning breeze, and she was scribbling notes in a series of tiny, exacting symbols. I could see her checking her watch, glancing at the driveway, then at the street, as though she were timing each of my imagined infractions. The bottle she had held yesterday was nowhere in sight, replaced by the impression of meticulous planning. This was the level of precision that belonged to someone who had decided that a single household could become a project, a case study, and a personal vendetta all at once. I thought of the neighbors, who must have been watching through half-open curtains, and I could almost hear their collective intake of breath. They had likely seen her slip quietly behind hedges before, always precise, always focused, never approaching, never apologizing, always observing. I realized she had been documenting my life for days, maybe even weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to escalate her campaign. Her methods were obsessive, surgical, and completely beyond reason. Karen shifted again, making careful notes, marking small corners of the driveway with what looked like tiny flags or stakes. She leaned forward, whispering to herself, as if narrating a story only she could understand. Each note she made, each measurement she recorded, was a calculated step toward a plan I couldn't yet comprehend. I watched, frozen, as she peeked over the hedge to measure the angles of my car, the distance from my garage to the curb, and the exact space where I stepped each morning. The morning stretched on, the world slowly waking, but she remained there, unwavering, silent except for the faint scratching of her pen. I understood then that this wasn't just harassment, this was preparation. Every detail she captured, every motion she observed, would soon come together in a way that would force me to respond, carefully, strategically, because she had chosen this moment, this property, and this car for her next act of obsession. By mid-morning, the tension had grown to a palpable weight in the air. I returned to my car after grabbing a coffee, and that's when I noticed the small piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly smudged as if it had been written in haste or carried in her pocket through the morning dew. My heart sank when I saw the words scrawled across it, precise and deliberate. "You will pay for your insolence," it read. There was no signature, no embellishment, just a chilling promise that seemed to hover in the space between the paper and my chest. I felt as though the threat had been aimed directly at me rather than the car. I looked around, half expecting her to appear from behind a hedge or a fence post, clipboard in hand, ready to declare her victory. But she was nowhere in sight, just the echo of her previous shrieking phone calls hanging in the quiet cul-de-sac. I realized that this note was not a random act of irritation. It was calculated, a psychological escalation designed to unsettle, to make me question my own safety. The greenish bottle from yesterday lingered in my mind like a ghost, and I couldn't help but imagine what she might do next, how far she was willing to go. I slid into the driver's seat and studied the note again. Every word felt deliberate, measured, and heavy with intention. I could almost see her crouched over her desk at home or behind a hedge, plotting, imagining how I would react, delighting in the anxiety it would generate. The neighborhood was quiet now, but I knew the sounds of distant bird calls and the occasional car passing could not mask the gravity of what she had set in motion. I felt the presence of witnesses in their homes, peeking through blinds, sharing silent glances of alarm, sensing the escalation before it even became visible. The note made it clear that Karen's actions were no longer about minor disputes, parking spots, or HOA rules. This was personal. Her obsession had crossed the line into threatening territory, and I could feel the weight of her intent pressing down. Every careful step I had taken to avoid conflict seemed meaningless in the face of her deliberate escalation. She had signaled her plans with precision, leaving a breadcrumb trail for me to find, forcing me to recognize that her fixation was moving towards something tangible, something dangerous. As I held the paper, I understood that this was the point of no return. The note was not just a warning, it was an invitation into a carefully choreographed psychological battle. I had to respond, but carefully, strategically, aware that every movement would be observed, every reaction catalogued, and every mistake potentially exploited. Karen had declared war with ink on paper, and the cul-de-sac had become her battlefield. I had barely started the car when I noticed her again, slipping around the corner like she had rehearsed this entrance 100 times. Her hand clutched the familiar greenish bottle, and this time I could see the label more clearly. The letters were faded, the warnings partially rubbed away, but enough remained to make my stomach twist. Corrosive, handle with extreme care. My mind raced. She had not brought a thermos of coffee, a clipboard, or even binoculars. She had brought a weapon disguised in a bottle, and she had set her sights on my car. Karen moved with unnerving precision, almost as if she were performing a ritual, tilting the bottle slightly to catch the sunlight, making the liquid inside glint like some toxic jewel. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the space between herself and my vehicle, calculating distances, angles, trajectories. I realized that yesterday had been the prelude, a way to test boundaries, but this morning the intent was clear. She had chosen her moment, and she had chosen her method. I felt a chill run down my spine as the implications settled over me. I tried speaking, keeping my voice calm, hoping to insert reason where there was none. "Karen, what are you doing? Put that down." She ignored me, her attention completely absorbed in the bottle and the imagined damage it might inflict. Every step she took toward the car was deliberate, measured, and slow, giving the impression that she was savoring the moment, calculating her triumph before it even began. The neighbors were stirring behind curtains and blinds, small heads peeking out to witness the unfolding scene. Mr. Thompson stood on his porch with binoculars trained on her, silent and watchful, cataloging every movement, every twitch of her hand. He didn't intervene, but his presence was like a quiet acknowledgement that someone else was witnessing this calculated madness. Karen lifted the bottle slightly, turning it in her hand as if to inspect it, and I noticed the faint green liquid swirl, catching the sunlight in a way that made it glow ominously. It was absurd and terrifying, the combination of her obsession and the chemical in her grasp. I understood then that this was no longer about petty neighborhood grievances or imaginary parking violations. This was personal, deliberate, and dangerous. The bottle in her hand was the first tangible indication that she was willing to cross a line, and every instinct in my body screamed that I had to act carefully, methodically, and strategically, because one wrong move might provoke her into taking the threat from imagination to reality. I stepped out of the car slowly, keeping my hands raised and my voice calm, trying to reach some sense of reason. "Karen, what are you doing? Put that down and step back," I said, carefully measuring every word so as not to provoke her. Her head tilted slightly, and she let out a sharp laugh that had no humor in it. Her eyes were wide, gleaming with obsession, and she didn't answer. Instead, she swiveled the bottle in her hand, keeping her focus fixed entirely on my car, as if it were the source of all evil in her world. I moved closer, hoping proximity would force recognition of reality, hoping logic might penetrate her frenzy. "Look, whatever problem you think you're fixing, this isn't the way to do it. Step away from the car," I said again, my voice calm but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had been tested by countless unpredictable situations in the past. She tilted her body slightly, like a cat ready to pounce, clutching the bottle more tightly. Her lips moved in silent muttering, counting or perhaps rehearsing the consequences she imagined I deserved. The street was quiet except for distant birds and the occasional hum of a car in the distance, but it felt as though time had slowed. Neighbors peeked through blinds and half-open doors, whispering to one another, frozen by curiosity and fear. Mr. Thompson, across the street on his porch, kept his binoculars trained on her, scribbling notes in his weathered notebook with deliberate care. He didn't intervene, but his calm observation was almost a counterweight to her frenzy, a quiet reminder that her actions were being witnessed and catalogued. Karen's hand trembled slightly as she raised the bottle, her eyes flicking toward me for the first time. There was a spark of awareness, but it was mingled with defiance. "This is what needs to happen," she muttered under her breath, loud enough that I could hear it clearly. She took a small step forward, and my stomach tightened. Every instinct screamed that this was her testing limits, gauging my response, seeking the exact moment to escalate. I held my ground, keeping my hands visible, voice steady, and eyes locked on hers. "Step back and calm down, Karen. This isn't you. This isn't reality. You can put it down and walk away," I said, measuring every syllable. She paused, the tremor in her hands betraying the tension in her mind, and for the briefest moment, the calculated predator wavered, as though considering the choice between obsession and reason. That pause, though fleeting, was the opening I needed to survive the first real escalation of her wrath. I didn't realize at first that the entire confrontation had been captured. A neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Patel, had been filming through her window, her phone balanced carefully on the sill as she whispered updates to her husband. When I glanced over, I saw the faint glow of the screen, and it hit me that every step Karen had taken, every muttered threat, and every obsessive movement with that greenish bottle was being documented. The weight of it settled over me, equal parts relief and dread, because the footage could either protect me or turn the neighborhood into a circus. Karen didn't know. She continued pacing, leaning over the car, gesturing wildly as if narrating some grand moral lesson for an audience that didn't exist. Her shouts carried, piercing the quiet morning like sirens, but the lens captured the absurdity, the meticulous obsession, and the utter futility of her mission. I realized then that she had been performing for herself, imagining an audience of justice-minded neighbors, but the real audience was invisible, and it was recording. Every glare, every hiss, every tightening of her grip on the bottle would now be evidence rather than intimidation. I slipped quietly back into my house, peeking through the blinds to see her still there, caught in her own loop of imagined righteousness. The neighbor's recording device blinked, capturing her movements in vivid detail. The sunlight glinted off the liquid inside the bottle, making it glow as though it were some poisonous jewel she intended to bestow upon my car. My pulse quickened at the thought of what could have happened if she had succeeded, but at the same time, I knew that the camera had turned the tables. The obsessive attention she had lavished on me, the meticulous documentation of my routine, now worked against her. By mid-morning, whispers had spread through the neighborhood. People gathered behind curtains, peeked from windows, and started sharing the footage on phones and neighborhood chats. The video circulated faster than I could process. Karen's every move, captured and replayed, was now public, a living document of her obsession and her escalating madness. I realized that the evidence was perfect, undeniable, and ironically, created entirely by her own actions. Her fixation on proving my supposed wrongdoing had become a record of her unhinged behavior, and the neighbors were finally seeing it in full. For the first time, I felt a flicker of control in the chaos. Karen's plan, whatever it had been, was collapsing under the weight of her own obsession. Every frame of video was a shield, a warning, and a message that the world was watching. The viral potential of the recording meant that her actions would not go unnoticed or unchallenged, and I understood that this was the turning point. The obsession that had haunted my driveway for days had inadvertently captured the proof I needed to defend myself, and the neighborhood was about to see just how far her delusions had gone. Karen was still circling my car when it happened. I watched in disbelief as her grip on the bottle faltered, the green liquid sloshing inside like it had a mind of its own. She had been so focused on me, so consumed by her imagined sense of justice, that she hadn't noticed the edge of the curb beneath her foot. It caught, just slightly, and the bottle wobbled. My stomach sank. I knew instinctively that if the liquid touched my car, the damage could be irreversible. I froze, my hands tight on the window frame, waiting to see what she would do next. The bottle slipped, slowly at first, almost in slow motion, then faster, and landed on her designer purse with a wet splat. The green liquid spread, soaking the leather and immediately beginning to eat into it. Her eyes widened in horror, and she instinctively grabbed at it, but it was too late. The smell of burning leather filled the air, pungent and acrid, and she screamed, the sound carrying across the street. The neighbors, who had been peeking through blinds and half-open doors, gasped in unison, and a few even came out onto their porches to witness the chaos. I wanted to intervene, to help, but there was an almost mesmerizing quality to watching her flail, caught in the consequences of her own obsession. She stomped and waved her hands, trying to salvage her purse, but the corrosive liquid had already done its work. Her carefully applied makeup had begun to smear from the panic and the sweat, and the clipboard she had tucked under one arm slipped to the ground, papers fluttering like frightened birds. For a moment she seemed suspended in disbelief, staring at the ruin she had created for herself, and I realized that the first tangible act of her vendetta had backfired spectacularly. I could see the shift in her energy. The confident, predatory posture from yesterday was gone, replaced by frantic, scrambling, desperate attempts to regain control over something that had already slipped beyond her grasp. Her plan, meticulously rehearsed in her mind, had misfired, and she was forced to confront the immediate consequences in real time. The neighbors whispered, recording again. Phones aimed to capture every expression of panic and fury. For the first time, I felt a sliver of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that she was still dangerous and unhinged. The bottle had not reached my car, and her purse lay ruined at her feet. Her obsession had turned inward, and the chaos she had sought to unleash on me had become the first public evidence of her unraveling. The green liquid glistened in the sunlight, a quiet monument to her miscalculation, and I realized that her vendetta had just taken its first misstep, one that would ripple through the neighborhood for days to come. The chaos had barely begun to settle when neighbors started appearing, drawn out by the commotion, whispers, and the smell of burnt leather. Mr. Thompson was the first to step forward, his expression tight with concern, but he didn't move toward her directly. He assessed the scene from a safe distance, muttering under his breath as if counting the risks and gauging the best approach. Behind him, a few others cautiously emerged from doorways, eyes wide with equal parts fascination and fear. It was clear that everyone had been aware of Karen's growing obsession, but no one had expected it to escalate so quickly. I stepped back and watched as Mrs. Vega, a neighbor from across the street, grabbed towels from her car, moving toward the scene with measured steps. She didn't say anything at first, simply assessing where to place herself so she could help without making the situation worse. Another neighbor brought a bucket of water, and soon a small group had formed, forming an impromptu barrier between Karen and my car. They didn't confront her aggressively, but their presence made it clear that the neighborhood was not going to stand by and watch her act with impunity. Karen's eyes darted between the crowd and the ruined purse at her feet, and for a moment I thought she might retreat. But she didn't. She stomped, gesturing wildly, trying to regain control, as if the universe itself had conspired to ruin her plans. The green liquid that had spilled from the bottle glistened in the sunlight, a visible testament to her failure, and I realized that every step she took now was being witnessed and documented by a growing audience. I could hear murmurs among the neighbors, voices hushed but urgent, as they exchanged observations and quietly coordinated. Towels were pressed to the ruined leather, water was poured carefully, and someone began capturing footage on a phone to document the incident. It was strange and reassuring at the same time. They weren't just trying to stop her, they were capturing her actions as evidence, preserving proof of her recklessness and obsession. Karen's panic became more visible, the confident swagger of the previous days replaced by frantic attempts to salvage what she could. The neighbor's calm, measured interventions contrasted sharply with her erratic energy, highlighting how completely she had miscalculated the morning. The quiet determination of those around her turned her own spectacle into a scene of public accountability. The moment that had started as a private vendetta had now become a collective response, a neighborhood standing together against obsession and chaos. It was the first time I felt hope that her actions would not go unchecked, that her vendetta might finally encounter limits imposed by reality rather than imagination. By mid-morning, the tension had drawn more attention than I expected. Officer Daniels returned, his patrol car rolling slowly into the cul-de-sac, lights muted but presence unmistakable. He stepped out, scanning the scene, eyes narrowing at the chaos and the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered. Karen spun toward him as if sensing an ally, clutching the greenish bottle in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other, her face twisted into an expression of outrage and self-righteousness. Daniels didn't rush. He took measured steps toward the center of the driveway, his hands visible, maintaining the kind of calm authority that demanded attention without escalating panic. "What's happening here?" he asked, voice even and steady, more observation than accusation. Karen launched into a torrent of words, rattling off complaints about trespassing, neighborhood violations, and the necessity of chemical enforcement as though he had been waiting for this explanation all morning. She held up the bottle like evidence of some imaginary threat, trying to convince him that my car and I were a danger to her carefully curated sense of order. I stepped forward, showing my hands and keeping my tone measured. "Officer Daniels, she's threatening my property with that chemical. She has already spilled some of it on her purse. I don't know what she intends next, but this is dangerous." He glanced at the neighbors who were holding towels and buckets, at the ruined leather still glistening with green liquid, and finally at Karen, who was mid-rant, flailing slightly with a mixture of panic and defiance. Daniels sighed softly, assessing the situation. His eyes flicked to the bottle, then back to Karen. He motioned for her to set it down, and she stiffened, raising it slightly as if daring him to intervene. The tension between authority and obsession hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. I could feel the neighbors holding their collective breath, watching the interaction as if waiting to see whether reason would finally assert itself. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the small crowd documenting her every movement. Then, slowly, she placed the bottle on the curb. Daniels gave a sharp nod, signaling that the immediate threat was neutralized, but his expression suggested he understood how fragile the piece really was. The neighbors exhaled in unison, relief mingled with disbelief. Karen's fury had been checked, at least temporarily, by the steady authority of someone who could parse her chaos and recognize the danger she posed. For the first time since the bottle appeared, I felt a measure of safety, though it was fragile and temporary. The police presence had restored order, but the weight of what could have happened lingered in the morning air. Karen stood frozen for a moment, realizing that her meticulous planning had been met not with fear, but with calm, methodical intervention, and that realization sparked a new kind of panic in her eyes. By late morning, I was back inside my house, hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. My phone buzzed, and it was my lawyer calling, his voice calm but urgent. He had been following the situation through texts and videos my neighbors had shared. "Do not touch anything," he said firmly. "Do not confront her again. Every word, every action she has taken is now evidence, and it could be used against her or you if you misstep. You need to let it play out under controlled circumstances." I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing, realizing just how precarious the situation had become. The greenish liquid, the bottle, her frantic gestures, every shred of footage was already being documented. Karen's obsession had inadvertently created a perfect record, and any impulsive reaction could undermine my position entirely. I glanced out the window. She was pacing again, muttering under her breath, her hands clenching and unclenching around nothing visible to the casual observer. The neighbors lingered on their porches and behind curtains, watching, whispering, and occasionally holding up phones to record every new movement. The tension had shifted from fear to a kind of collective fascination. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster, the kind that no one could look away from, and yet everyone knew how quickly it could spiral into something dangerous. The lawyer continued, explaining in precise terms how the documentation she had inadvertently provided could be used. Her shrieks, her gestures, her attempts to intimidate me, all of it captured on multiple devices, could demonstrate her escalating obsession and recklessness. "This is good for you, in a strange way," he said. "Her own behavior is building your case. Do not interfere. Do not retaliate. You have to let the evidence exist exactly as it island." I nodded, more to myself than to him. I realized that Karen had made a critical error. She had assumed her actions were private, that her obsession could play out unseen. She hadn't accounted for witnesses, cameras, neighbors, and the very real possibility that someone with authority or legal insight would recognize the danger she posed. Every meticulous note, every obsessive measurement, every threat she had made was now a weapon that could be wielded against her. Hanging up, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The situation was still far from over. Karen's obsession was unchecked, her intentions unpredictable, and the bottle still symbolized the thin line between chaos and order. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind, reminding me that patience and careful strategy were now my only defenses. Her plan, whatever it was, had been documented perfectly, and the next steps would determine whether her obsession would unravel entirely or escalate into something far more dangerous. By midday, it became clear that Karen's own obsession had become her undoing. Every frantic gesture, every muttered accusation, every careful measurement she had made in her mission to punish my car had been captured on video, and I realized the enormity of what that meant. The neighbors who had peeked through windows and doorways were now whispering among themselves, comparing notes and sharing footage, unaware that they were creating the most comprehensive record of her unraveling. Her meticulous attention to detail, which had once filled me with anxiety, had become the source of undeniable evidence. I watched from the window as she crouched near the car, scrutinizing the angle of the wheels, the placement of the side mirror, and the spacing between my tires and the curb. The greenish liquid had been replaced with her frantic hand gestures, but the obsession remained the same, the energy unchanged. She was unaware that her every move was being recorded from multiple vantage points. Mr. Thompson, still observing with binoculars, had shifted to a small camera tucked discreetly under his jacket, documenting every expression, every tremor of her hand, and every flinch as she realized the bottle had damaged her purse. It struck me then that Karen had created a perfect record of her own obsession. She had treated this like a private vendetta, but in reality, it had become a public performance, captured from angles she had never considered. The footage recorded her escalating behavior, her irrational fury, and her fixation on my car in a way that no words could ever fully convey. I felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief as I realized that the evidence was practically building itself. Her own meticulousness, which had once made me anxious and cautious, now worked in my favor. The way she moved, the way she leaned, the way she muttered to herself and gestured with the bottle and clipboard were all cataloged on video, turning what had been a private obsession into a fully documented case of reckless intent. Every neighbor who had recorded her, every whispered observation, every screenshot shared online, had become part of a growing body of evidence that could not be ignored. I leaned back and let it sink in. Karen had overestimated her control, overestimated the power of her obsession, and underestimated the people around her. Her fixation, which had seemed so threatening, had accidentally created a record that would protect me and demonstrate just how far she had gone. The realization brought a strange sense of calm. The storm she had conjured for me had turned inward, documenting itself with a clarity and completeness that was almost cinematic, and it was only a matter of time before the full weight of her actions became undeniable. By early afternoon, the neighborhood had become a stage, and Karen's obsession had turned into a spectacle for anyone with a phone or a social media account. Clips of her pacing, her frantic gestures with the bottle, and her wild, almost theatrical expressions were circulating faster than I could follow. Neighbors shared footage, posting snippets to group chats and neighborhood forums, each one more absurd than the last. Comments flooded in, ranging from shock to laughter, disbelief to indignation. The narrative that had been private, carefully cultivated in her own mind, was now exploding across digital platforms, exposing the full extent of her irrational behavior. I watched from the kitchen window as Karen continued her antics, oblivious to the growing audience she had created. She waved her arms dramatically, muttered incoherently about property rights and imagined offenses, and paced back and forth with the intensity of someone performing for 1,000 unseen spectators. Every motion, every word, every step was being documented, replayed, and analyzed by neighbors and strangers alike. It was mesmerizing and terrifying, the way a private obsession could transform into a public performance, fueled by her own compulsions. The social media feeds filled with videos, GIFs, and slow-motion captures of her missteps. The green liquid in her bottle had become an icon of her irrational escalation, a symbol of obsession caught in the act. People laughed, commented, and shared, creating a viral narrative that none of us could have anticipated. Her meticulous preparation, her detailed attention to every perceived violation, had been turned into content for an audience she had never intended to reach. The neighbors who had recorded her initially to protect themselves were now unwitting broadcasters of her unraveling, and the momentum of the posts was unstoppable. I realized that Karen had created her own accountability in real time. Her obsession, which had begun as a personal vendetta, had backfired spectacularly. Every gesture, every frustrated mutter, every exaggerated step toward my car was now evidence for the neighborhood and beyond. The viral spread of her actions ensured that she could not easily deny her behavior, and the collective attention of viewers both near and far created a pressure that even her delusions could not withstand. By mid-afternoon, her audience was no longer just neighbors. Friends of friends, curious strangers, and people from neighboring towns had begun following the clips. The story of Karen's irrational escalation was spreading like wildfire. Her obsession, meant to intimidate, had transformed into a public record, a viral testament to the limits of entitlement and the consequences of letting obsession dictate action. Every view, every comment, every share solidified her unraveling in real time. By evening, Karen had decided to escalate her vendetta from the street to the official setting of the HOA meeting. She arrived carrying a thick binder, her movements precise and deliberate, as if stepping into that room conferred authority she had never earned. The fluorescent lights reflected off her perfectly styled hair, giving her the appearance of someone who believed the law itself had been redesigned to follow her rules. She positioned herself at the front of the room, flipping open the binder with careful flourishes and spreading papers across the table, charts and spreadsheets meticulously organized to prove her imagined point. I sat at the back, heart pounding, watching her transform the meeting into a stage for her obsession. She spoke rapidly, her voice dripping with urgency and self-importance. She described minor infractions as catastrophic threats, reinterpreting neighborhood guidelines to suit her narrative. Every complaint about parking, landscaping, or curbside placement became evidence of a personal vendetta. I could feel the tension in the room grow as she gestured toward each sheet of paper, her eyes sweeping the attendees with a gaze that demanded unquestioning agreement. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered quietly, trading incredulous glances, while others held their phones up, capturing every moment. Karen's insistence on legality and precision was undermined by the absurdity of her evidence, the meticulous obsession that had turned a routine HOA meeting into a spectacle. Her charts showed measurements down to fractions of an inch, photographs of my car parked legally, and timelines that documented imagined offenses with obsessive detail. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that her vendetta had grown beyond reason and that her own documentation was now a testament to her unraveling. As she continued, I noticed the subtle glances of the board members, their polite nods masking a mix of disbelief and incredulity. Karen's attempts to weaponize the HOA rules against me were being overshadowed by the absurdity of her own meticulous obsession. Every step she had taken, every measurement she had recorded, every threat she had made, had created a record of escalating behavior that made her arguments impossible to take seriously. Her sense of control, so rigid in her mind, was crumbling under the weight of her own documentation and the witnesses surrounding her. By the time she finished presenting, the room was quiet but tense, a mixture of stunned neighbors and suppressed laughter at the spectacle they had witnessed. Her plans to assert authority had backfired spectacularly. The HOA meeting, meant to give her legitimacy, had instead exposed the extent of her obsession, and the viral clips from the street had already circulated, amplifying the humiliation. What had started as a personal vendetta had now become a public performance of self-destruction, and everyone in that room was aware that her control over the narrative was gone. Karen left the HOA meeting with a simmering intensity that could be felt in the hallway. Her steps were quick, deliberate, and sharp, like she was carrying the weight of some personal mission only she could understand. I had barely returned home when I saw her through the front window, pacing in the cul-de-sac again, her body taut, movements precise and controlled. She held the greenish bottle with renewed determination, and her eyes were fixed on my car as though it had personally wronged her. The bottle had become more than a prop. It had become an extension of her obsession, a symbol of the power she imagined she held over me. I felt the tension rise in my chest as she took careful steps toward the vehicle, measuring angles, calculating distances, and muttering to herself in low, urgent bursts. The neighbors, some still recovering from the HOA spectacle, peeked from behind curtains and doorways, whispering among themselves, recording every motion. Every time she shifted her weight or adjusted her grip, the anticipation grew, and I knew that she was testing the limits of both her own control and mine. The green liquid glistened in the sunlight, catching at angles that made it look almost alive, almost purposeful. I realized that the situation had escalated beyond confrontation or negotiation. This was no longer about words, charts, or HOA rules. This was about action, and the potential consequences were terrifying. I tried to speak through the window, my voice steady but firm, appealing to some rational part of her mind. "Karen, stop. Step back. This isn't a solution." She didn't acknowledge me, her focus absolute, her obsession blinding her to reason. Her gestures grew more animated, a subtle threat in every movement, and I understood that the culmination of days of planning, obsession, and fixation was about to take a tangible form. My car, my property, and my sense of safety all hung in the balance, and I could feel the eyes of the neighbors on me as well, sharing in the fear, curiosity, and helpless anticipation. Her pause near the front bumper was fleeting, but in that moment, the weight of the situation pressed down. The bottle in her hands, the meticulous notes she had taken, and the hours she had spent observing my routines all converged into an imminent escalation. I realized that every reaction I made, every move, would be scrutinized and could provoke her further. This was a battle of patience, strategy, and nerve. Karen had crossed the threshold from obsession to potential action, and the entire neighborhood was about to witness the next act of her unraveling. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had begun to take matters into its own hands. After witnessing Karen's relentless pacing and obsessive focus on my car, several neighbors quietly stepped outside, drawn by curiosity and concern. Mrs. Vega brought a bucket of water. Mr. Thompson adjusted his binoculars, and others lingered on porches, phones in hand, documenting every movement. Their presence was quiet but deliberate, a subtle barrier forming between her and my vehicle. The collective weight of observation and quiet intervention created a buffer that began to unsettle Karen. She was used to being the center of control, the focal point of her imagined authority, but now the eyes of multiple witnesses challenged her dominance. I watched her pause near the car, the greenish liquid still in her hand, her grip tightening as she realized she was no longer the only one asserting control. The neighbors moved carefully, coordinating without words, instinctively understanding that any aggressive motion could provoke her further. Towels and buckets were positioned strategically, ready to contain any mess if the bottle tipped or leaked, and cameras discreetly recorded the unfolding scene. Their calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with her erratic energy, highlighting the futility of her vendetta and the isolation that her obsession had created. Karen's gaze darted from face to face, measuring reactions, and I could see panic begin to creep into her expression. The confidence she had carried for days was faltering as the realization settled in that she was being observed by more than one pair of eyes. Every gesture, every muttered threat, every careful step she had rehearsed in her mind now had witnesses, and she could not simply rewrite the narrative to her liking. Her obsession, which had once allowed her to control her perception of the situation, now trapped her in a visible, accountable reality. I felt a mixture of relief and tension as the community's involvement created a form of protection without confrontation. The neighborhood had become a collective shield, and their quiet, coordinated presence turned her private vendetta into a public spectacle. Every neighbor who had stepped outside contributed to the containment of her erratic behavior, not with aggression, but with attention and documentation, subtly asserting that her obsession would not continue unchecked. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Karen's energy had shifted from confident control to frantic calculation. The neighborhood had joined together in a way that amplified accountability and diminished her authority. What had begun as a personal vendetta had now evolved into a collective act of observation and containment, and the first real cracks in her imagined power were beginning to show. By the next morning, the neighborhood's whispers had transformed into a full-blown social media storm. Clips from the previous day's chaos began circulating across Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, each upload capturing Karen in mid-gesture, her face contorted with obsession, the greenish liquid bottle ever present. Neighbors had shared footage they had filmed from windows and porches, adding captions that highlighted the absurdity of her antics. Within hours, Karen's vendetta was no longer a private obsession. It had become public entertainment. I watched from my window as new images of her spread across phones and feeds, edited into GIFs and memes that exaggerated the chaos she had created. One meme showed her crouching near the car with wide, wild eyes and a caption that read, "Neighborhood justice level. Expert." Another captured the moment the bottle slipped and ruined her purse, the text overlay proclaiming, "Acid Karen's first casualty." The humor was biting but inescapably real, and the absurdity of her obsession became the point of fascination for an audience far larger than she had imagined. Karen moved through the cul-de-sac, unaware of the storm she had unleashed online. Every step, every frantic glance, every muttered phrase about property rights and perceived slights was now part of a narrative she could not control. The clips, shared by neighbors and strangers alike, reached beyond the small street, attracting viewers from other towns who had never witnessed a vendetta of such obsessive proportions. Her every attempt at authority was rendered ironic by the viral context. I noticed the subtle shift in her behavior as the digital wave of exposure grew. She began to glance nervously at neighbors' phones, trying to gauge their reactions, unaware that each scroll and tap was amplifying the spectacle. The meticulously rehearsed vendetta that had begun with a bottle and a few obsessive measurements had transformed into a live, public record of her unraveling. Social media had turned her own actions into evidence against her, and every post, share, and comment served as a mirror reflecting the full extent of her obsession. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood had become a hybrid of witness and audience. People stopped by doors and windows to watch, laughing quietly at the gifs that highlighted her miscalculations. Karen's own obsession, meant to intimidate and control, had become a tool for accountability. The viral memes ensured that her actions could not be hidden or denied. Her plan to assert dominance over me in the street had inadvertently made her the center of a collective narrative, one that exposed her compulsions for all to see. The public scrutiny was relentless, and the realization of that visibility began to sink in, creating the first genuine cracks in her confident facade. By the evening, I realized that Karen's obsession had created a situation that could no longer be handled casually. Her escalating actions, meticulously documented by neighbors and captured across social media, had built a record that demanded formal attention. My lawyer called, his voice steady but urgent, explaining that the evidence she had generated herself made it possible to take legal action immediately. I felt a mix of relief and apprehension, knowing that while the documentation was in my favor, the escalation could easily spiral further if mishandled. Every moment I hesitated allowed her obsession to grow, and her unpredictability made careful planning essential. I reviewed the videos and screenshots again, watching her gestures, the greenish bottle, and the frantic pacing. Every frame was damning, and the viral clips showed her intent with startling clarity. It was obvious that she had been preparing for confrontation, timing her movements and reactions with obsessive precision. Her own compulsions had created a perfect chain of evidence, capturing her determination to intimidate and threaten in real time. My lawyer emphasized the importance of restraint. I could not approach her, could not react impulsively, and could not risk provoking her further. The legal strategy now relied entirely on letting the documentation speak for itself. I contacted the court to initiate filings for harassment, attempted property damage, and reckless endangerment. Each call, each form, each detail submitted was weighed carefully to ensure that the legal response would match the scope of her escalating obsession. Karen had assumed control of the narrative through intimidation, but her meticulous recordings had unintentionally provided the proof that would strip her of that control. The process was methodical, deliberate, and precise, mirroring the same attention to detail she had lavished on her vendetta. Neighbors continued to monitor her, sharing updates and providing additional footage. Their involvement created an extended network of observation, strengthening the case and ensuring that any further escalation would be documented. Every post, every meme, every whispered observation contributed to a growing record of accountability. The legal countdown had begun, and while the end was not yet in sight, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. Karen's obsession, which had once filled the street with tension and fear, now worked against her. The preparations she had invested so heavily in had created an irrefutable case, and the next steps would determine whether her actions would result in temporary embarrassment or long-term consequences. By the time night fell, I felt a cautious sense of control. The legal framework was in motion, the evidence secured, and the neighbors' vigilance created a buffer that had never existed before. Karen's carefully plotted vendetta had collided with reality, and the countdown to accountability had begun. The morning of the court hearing felt like walking into another world. The courthouse loomed large, its marble floors reflecting the fluorescent lights above, and the faint hum of activity echoed through the hallways. I arrived early, nerves coiled tight, dressed in a simple suit that felt heavier than it should have. Karen was already there, binder in hand, standing at the front of the room with her usual intensity, scanning the room as if expecting an audience of believers ready to endorse her actions. Her gaze met mine briefly, sharp and calculating, and I could feel the weight of her obsession pressing across the space between us. The courtroom gradually filled with neighbors, some still carrying phones, others whispering quietly, all of them drawn by the spectacle and the anticipation of accountability. Their presence was steady, a collective awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. Karen began her presentation immediately, flipping through her charts, pointing at photographs, and reading aloud from carefully prepared notes that documented minor grievances as though they were existential threats. She spoke rapidly, her voice insistent and commanding, attempting to impose order through narrative, to make the absurd seem credible. I sat quietly, listening, noting every gesture, every overemphasized pause, every dramatic flourish. The binder she had brought seemed to grow heavier with each page, as if the weight of her obsession had physical form. Her arguments twisted minor disputes into elaborate chains of imagined offenses, and she gestured toward the greenish bottle she had left by the side, as though it were a tool of justice rather than evidence of recklessness. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Her voice was measured and authoritative, reviewing the evidence before her with the patience of someone who had seen countless disputes unfold, but few so theatrically extreme. When the videos of Karen's actions began to play, her gestures, her pacing, and her frantic attempts to intimidate became undeniable. The room collectively absorbed the spectacle, and murmurs of disbelief and quiet laughter rippled through the audience. Every clip confirmed what the neighbors had seen. Every frame corroborated the pattern of obsessive, reckless behavior that had escalated to threats against property. By the time Karen finished her presentation, the courtroom energy had shifted. The neighbors' quiet vigilance, the documentation captured on phones and video, and the legal record itself had transformed her meticulous obsession into proof of her own recklessness. The carefully constructed narrative she had rehearsed for days crumbled under the weight of evidence, and it became clear that her plan to assert control had been undone by the very obsession that had driven her every move. The stage had shifted, and I realized that accountability was no longer a question. The moment of truth arrived when the court began reviewing the final pieces of evidence. Karen's presentation, which she had rehearsed obsessively, was crumbling under the weight of her own actions. The videos and photos captured by neighbors, the recordings from her frantic gestures, and even the snippets of her tirades that had gone viral online all painted the same picture. Each attempt she had made to intimidate me or assert control now stood as proof of her recklessness. The irony was unmistakable. She had planned every step meticulously, believing that her obsession could dominate the narrative, but it had instead documented her undoing. As the judge examined the footage, I watched Karen fidget with her binder, her confidence faltering. Her eyes darted nervously to the screen, to the rows of neighbors who had come to witness the proceedings, and finally to me. The greenish bottle that had loomed over the past week like a symbol of threat was conspicuously absent, a silent reminder of her miscalculation. She had intended it as a weapon against my car, against my sense of security, and yet it had ended up destroying only her own possessions when she had slipped and ruined her purse. The very object that had symbolized her obsessive control had betrayed her, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. The judge's voice was calm but firm as she highlighted the evidence of her escalating obsession, the deliberate measurements, the pacing, the threatening gestures, and the obsessive documentation were now all official records. The courtroom audience absorbed it in stunned silence. Karen's careful plans to assert dominance had backfired spectacularly, and the tension that had filled the cul-de-sac for days shifted into the satisfaction of justice realized. The neighbors, the ones who had quietly observed and documented from their porches, now sat in the gallery, witnessing the irony unfold in real time. When the final ruling was read, it became clear that Karen's actions had consequences she could not control. Her meticulous obsession, intended to intimidate and dominate, had created a perfect record against her. Her car remained unharmed, protected by the calm intervention of witnesses and the law, while she faced the undeniable reality of accountability. The irony was complete. The very obsession that had filled her days and nights, that had driven her to a near-constant state of calculation, had become the instrument of her downfall. Her vendetta, meant to assert power, had instead recorded her unraveling for all to see, leaving the neighbors, the court, and me to witness the poetic justice that reality had delivered. By the following day, Karen's courtroom debacle had become the talk of the town, and news crews began arriving in the cul-de-sac, cameras trained on the scene as if it were the premiere of a theater production. Reporters hovered on sidewalks, microphones extended, asking neighbors for their impressions while phones and cameras from every direction recorded the spectacle. Clips from the viral footage had already circulated online, and local journalists had picked up the story, weaving together her obsession, the greenish bottle, the ruined purse, and her courtroom missteps into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. I watched from my window as Karen, still attempting to assert some semblance of control, flitted between the camera crews, her binder clutched tightly in one hand and her notes spread across her arms. Her carefully constructed arguments and obsessive gestures, meant to intimidate and assert authority, now played back to her in front of an audience far larger than she had imagined. She became the center of a media storm, and with every angle the cameras captured, her plan to dominate the narrative unraveled further. The reporters asked questions she could not answer, and her expressions flickered between defiance, panic, and disbelief as her obsession collided with public scrutiny. Neighbors were now giving interviews, narrating what they had witnessed, sharing first-hand accounts of her escalating actions, her pacing, and her fixation on my car. The recordings from phones and social media feeds provided a visual record that reinforced every statement. Karen's obsessive behavior, which had once been her source of power, had become her undoing in the eyes of the public. Every gesture, every muttered complaint, and every calculated movement that she had performed with precision was now evidence, amplified and dissected by journalists who treated her antics as both news and cautionary tale. The greenish bottle, once a symbol of her imagined threat, was now a focal point of every broadcast. Close-ups of her slipping and ruining her purse played repeatedly, accompanied by commentary that highlighted the irony of her actions. Her attempts to control the narrative through intensity and obsession only drew more attention, ensuring that her actions were not only documented but broadcast widely. Karen had transformed from a private antagonist into a public spectacle, and the intensity of the coverage made it clear that her obsession had consequences beyond the street, the courtroom, and the neighborhood. The media frenzy had taken her carefully planned vendetta and elevated it, showing that obsessive behavior, no matter how meticulously executed, could be dismantled by visibility, documentation, and public scrutiny. By the end of the week, the cul-de-sac felt almost normal again, but it was clear that the neighborhood had shifted in subtle ways. Karen had retreated to her house, her presence diminished, her usual energy replaced by a tense quiet that hung over the property like a cloud. The once ominous pacing and obsessive glances toward my car had vanished, replaced by the cautious stillness of someone who had realized that their actions carried consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Her vendetta, so meticulously planned and relentlessly executed, had left her exposed, and the street felt lighter, freer as a result. Neighbors emerged gradually from their homes, exchanging smiles and relieved glances, cautiously reclaiming their porches and lawns. Conversations no longer whispered warnings but recounted the events with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. The viral footage, the courtroom documentation, and the media coverage had created a permanent record of Karen's unraveling, and the collective awareness of her obsession served as both a warning and a reassurance. The tension that had dominated the block for days was giving way to a sense of restored order. I walked slowly to my car, inspecting it for damage and noticing, with a mixture of relief and lingering wariness, that it remained untouched. The greenish bottle that had once symbolized the threat was gone, a reminder of her miscalculations and the fragility of obsessive control. The neighbors who had intervened, recording footage and offering quiet support, smiled and waved, their presence now a comforting reminder that accountability could emerge organically through observation and solidarity. The community had, almost without realizing it, imposed a balance, turning Karen's obsession inward and leaving her to confront the consequences alone. Even Karen's attempts to reclaim authority through the HOA, her binder, and her meticulous charts had been neutralized. The combination of public exposure, legal accountability, and neighborly vigilance had dismantled the carefully constructed framework she had relied on for control. Her obsession, once a source of tension and fear, had become a record of her unraveling, leaving her isolated and diminished in influence. As the sun set, the cul-de-sac returned to a sense of routine and calm. Laughter drifted from porches, doors opened without caution, and the subtle rhythm of daily life resumed. Karen's vendetta had ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet and unyielding force of accountability, visibility, and consequence. The neighborhood had reset itself, stronger and wiser, leaving behind the echoes of obsession and a clear lesson that control achieved through fear and fixation is always temporary, especially when the community stands together. And that, my friends, is how Karen tried to ruin my car with acid and ended up dissolving her own life instead. If you made it to the end, congratulations, you've just witnessed a perfect storm of entitlement, chemistry, and karma. Smash that subscribe button for more tales where bullies discover that reality has a better sense of humor than they do. Drop your comment below with the wildest Karen story you've ever seen because, trust me, sharing makes surviving these encounters a little easier. Until next time, may your cars stay pristine, your neighbors stay sane, and your karma hit just right.